Some gemstones are rare, but one of the stones in this video was never supposed to be touched. Not because it's dangerous, not because it's locked away, but because by the time most people learn it exists, it's already gone. Another stone was held, bought, and sold for years without anyone realizing what it actually was. And one of them? For decades, the entire planet believed only two existed. Think about that for a second. Not two minds, not two locations. Two. So what does rare even mean? When something can exist, but almost no one can experience it. Because the stones in this video don't just challenge rarity, they challenge access. Some can't be mined anymore. Some are controlled so tightly that money isn't enough. And some exist in a way that quietly removes them from the world entirely. Which raises a question most people never ask. If something exists, but you will never be in the same room as it, does it really exist for you? This is not about the most expensive gemstones. This is about something far more unsettling, gems that exist, but were never meant to be held. Let's start with one that exists in only one place on Earth, ranked 10th, Benitoite, the stone that shouldn't exist in just one place. Some gemstones are rare because they are difficult to mine. Others are rare because demand outpaces supply. But Benitoite belongs to a far more unusual category, a gemstone that exists in only one known location on Earth. Not a region, not a country. One small area in San Benito County, California. That detail alone changes everything. Because when a gemstone is tied to a single geological pocket, its future is no longer about discovery, it's about limitation. Once that source fades, the stone doesn't become harder to find. It begins to quietly disappear. At first glance, Benitoite doesn't demand attention. Its color sits somewhere between sapphire blue and something colder, almost electric. Clean, sharp, slightly unnatural. But the moment light interacts with it, the illusion breaks. This is where Benitoite reveals its true nature. It doesn't simply reflect light. It fractures it with an intensity that feels almost out of place in a natural crystal. Under ultraviolet light, it glows with a vivid blue fluorescence that seems less like a property and more like a response, as if the stone is reacting to something invisible. That contrast, calm in normal light, almost alive under the right conditions, is part of what makes Benitoite so difficult to categorize. It doesn't behave the way people expect a gemstone to behave. And yet, despite how visually striking it is, most people will never see one in person. Not because it's locked behind impossible pricing, but because access has quietly narrowed over time. The original mining site has faced restrictions, closures, and limited output for years. High-quality specimens rarely reach open markets. When they do, they tend to move quickly. Not through public storefronts, but through private networks, collectors, and specialists who already know exactly what they're looking for, which creates an unusual situation. Technically, Benitoite exists. Practically, it's absent. There are no widespread displays, no mainstream jewelry presence, no casual encounters. Even among gemstone enthusiasts, it often remains something known, but not experienced. And that raises a subtle but important shift in how rarity is understood. Because rarity isn't just about how many pieces exist, it's about how many people ever come close to one. Pause for a second and think about this. If something exists in the world, but almost no one can physically reach it, does it still feel real? Or does it start to become something closer to a story? Something repeated, described, but never actually seen? Benitoite sits right on that edge, a gemstone that hasn't disappeared, but is no longer part of everyday reality. And what makes this even more unsettling is that Benitoite is still considered the accessible end of this list. Because the next stone wasn't just hard to find. For decades, it was believed that only two existed on Earth, ranked 9th. Red beryl, the rarity hidden in plain sight. If Benitoite exists on the edge of disappearance, red beryl exists on the edge of probability. Because this is not just a rare gemstone, it is a statistical anomaly. Found in the Wah Wah Mountains of Utah, red beryl forms under such specific and unlikely geological conditions that its existence feels less like a process and more like an exception. The combination of beryllium, manganese, extreme heat, and volcanic activity must align with almost exact precision. If even one variable shifts slightly, the crystal simply never forms. And the result? For every 150,000 gem-quality diamonds discovered, only one red beryl of comparable quality is found. Not one mine, not one region, one stone. That number alone reframes everything most people believe about rarity. Because diamonds are often associated with exclusivity, yet they exist in global supply chains, massive distribution networks, and controlled markets. Red beryl, on the other hand, exists in fragments, scattered, limited, and rarely large enough to cut into faceted gemstones. Most specimens never make it into jewelry. Most never leave the ground in usable form. And even when they do, they are often too small, too included, or too fragile to survive the cutting process. What remains are stones that are not only rare in number, but rare in quality, a second layer of scarcity that quietly removes them from public reach. Visually, red beryl carries a deep, saturated red that can rival ruby, but with a slightly darker, more concentrated tone. There is no softness to it, no gradual fade. The color feels compressed, almost as if it has been forced into the crystal structure under pressure. And that's not far from the truth. Because unlike many gemstones that form over long, stable geological periods, red beryl forms in volatile environments, places where conditions are not meant to last, which makes every surviving crystal feel temporary, like something that managed to exist despite the odds. But here's where the story shifts. Unlike Benitoite, red beryl hasn't disappeared into private collections. It still appears, occasionally, in small quantities, in specialized markets, in places most people would never think to look. So technically it can be owned, but realistically almost no one ever will. Because rarity at this level doesn't announce itself. It doesn't sit in display cases or mainstream auctions. It moves quietly, often unnoticed, between people who already understand what it is, which creates a different kind of distance, not physical, but informational. If a gemstone exists, but most people don't even know where to find it, is it truly accessible, or does it only exist for those already inside the circle? And that's what makes red beryl so deceptive. It hasn't vanished. It hasn't been restricted. It's simply out of reach in a way that doesn't look like distance. And what comes next takes that idea even further. Because the next stone on this list isn't just rare, it's something most people have already seen and completely failed to recognize. Ranked 8th, Taaffeite, the gem. Almost no one realizes they've seen. Taaffeite is rare because it was never recognized. For decades, this stone existed in plain sight, passed through hands, examined, even collected, all while being mistaken for something else. Not because it lacked beauty, but because it lacked distinction. To the untrained eye, Taaffeite looks almost identical to spinel. Soft violet tones, occasional hints of pink or gray, a calm, understated appearance that doesn't demand attention. And that's exactly how it stayed invisible. It wasn't discovered in the ground. It was discovered after it had already been cut. In 1945, a gemologist noticed something unusual while examining a faceted stone that had already entered circulation. The optical properties didn't match spinel. The structure was different, subtle, almost undetectable, but undeniably wrong. That moment changed everything, because it meant Taaffeite had likely been misidentified for years, possibly decades, sitting inside collections, jewelry, and markets under the wrong name. And even now, that problem hasn't completely disappeared. Unlike gemstones with strong visual signatures, Taaffeite doesn't announce itself. Its colors are quiet. Its brilliance is controlled. It doesn't flash or glow or shift dramatically under light. Instead, it blends in, almost perfectly, with stones that are far more common, which creates a strange kind of rarity. Not the kind defined by how few exist, but by how few are recognized. Because somewhere right now, there may be stones sitting in collections, labeled as spinel, that are something else entirely, and no one knows. That possibility alone changes the way Taaffeite is experienced. It's not just difficult to find, It's difficult to identify even when it's already in front of you, which means access isn't limited by geography or price. It's limited by awareness. Pause for a moment and consider this. If a gemstone could pass through the world unnoticed, if it could be bought, sold, even worn, without anyone realizing what it truly is, then how many have already been missed? How many were held without ever being understood? Taaffeite sits in that uncertainty, a gemstone that doesn't hide itself, but doesn't reveal itself either. And that makes it uniquely inaccessible, because most people won't fail to find it. They'll fail to recognize it. And that quiet deception becomes even more unsettling when compared to what comes next. Because the next stone doesn't hide in plain sight. It exists in a form so limited that even when it's found, it almost never becomes something anyone can actually use. Ranked 7th, Grandidierite, the gem that exists, but almost never becomes one. By this point, rarity has already taken different forms: isolation, probability, misidentification. Grandidierite introduces something more subtle, a gemstone that exists, but almost never in a form that can be used. Discovered in Madagascar, Grandidierite is not unknown to science. In fact, mineral specimens have been studied, cataloged, and preserved for years. But there is a critical difference between a mineral existing and a gemstone being usable. Most Grandidierite is opaque, dense, fibrous, clouded. It doesn't transmit light in a way that allows it to be cut into the kind of gemstone people expect to see. The majority of what is found remains locked in that state, technically real, but visually inaccessible. And then on rare occasions, something different appears. A crystal with clarity, a structure that allows light to pass through. A version of Grandidierite that behaves like a true gemstone. That's the moment where rarity shifts into something far more extreme. Because now the limitation isn't just how much exists, it's how much exists in the right condition. Transparent, gem-quality Grandidierite is so rare that even experienced collectors may never encounter one outside of controlled environments, private collections, specialized exhibitions, or high-level transactions that never become public. And when these stones do appear, they often feel almost unreal, a soft blend of blue and green, sometimes shifting slightly depending on the angle of light. Not dramatic, not overwhelming, but precise, balanced in a way that suggests stability, even though its existence is anything but stable. There's a quiet tension in that contrast, because what looks calm is actually the result of extremely unlikely conditions aligning perfectly. And that's what separates Grandidierite from the stones before it. It doesn't hide, it doesn't deceive. It simply fails to become what it could have been. Think about that for a moment. If a gemstone exists in the ground, but almost never reaches a form that can be cut, worn, or even displayed, at what point does it stop being part of the gemstone world? At what point does it become something closer to potential rather than reality? Grandidierite sits exactly in that space, not absent, not unknown, but incomplete in a way that quietly removes it from human experience. And that's why most people will never hold one. Not because it's restricted, not because it's hidden, but because the version that could be held almost never forms. And as the list continues, that idea of instability begins to take on a different meaning. Because the next stone doesn't just depend on rare conditions to form, its identity itself changes, depending on how it's seen. Ranked 6th, Alexandrite, the gem that refuses to stay the same. By now, rarity has taken many forms: isolation, probability, invisibility, and even incompleteness. Alexandrite introduces something far more unsettling, a gemstone that cannot hold a single identity. At first glance, under natural daylight, Alexandrite appears green, calm, refined, almost understated. The kind of color that blends quietly into the world without drawing attention. But the moment the light changes, the stone changes with it. Under incandescent or warmer lighting, that same gemstone turns red. Not slightly, not gradually, completely. It's one of the most dramatic optical transformations found in any natural gemstone, often described as emerald by day, ruby by night. But even that description fails to capture what's actually happening. This isn't a surface effect. It's not a trick of reflection. It's a structural response to light itself. The crystal absorbs and reflects different wavelengths depending on the light source, revealing entirely different color profiles from the same material. Which means Alexandrite isn't just seen differently, it is different, depending on how it's observed. And that creates a form of rarity that doesn't exist in the stones before it. Because Alexandrite isn't defined by how few pieces exist. It's defined by how few stones display this effect with true intensity. Most Alexandrite on the market shows only a weak or partial color shift, a muted transition that lacks the dramatic contrast collectors look for. True high-quality Alexandrite, with a strong, clean change from green to red, is exceptionally rare. But here's where the story becomes more complicated. Unlike the stones earlier on this list, Alexandrite can be owned. It appears in high-end jewelry, it's sold at auction, it exists within reach, at least in theory. So why does it still belong here? Because what most people encounter isn't what Alexandrite truly is. The majority of stones labeled as Alexandrite either display minimal color change, are heavily included, or are so small that the effect is barely noticeable. The version that defines the stone, vivid, dramatic, unmistakable, exists in such limited supply that it rarely reaches public hands, which creates a subtle disconnect. People believe they've seen Alexandrite, but very few have actually experienced it. And that raises a different kind of question. If a gemstone changes depending on how it's seen, if its identity shifts with something as simple as light, then what exactly is the real version of it? Is it the green seen in daylight, the red seen at night, or is it something that only exists in the transition between the two? A moment most people never pay attention to? That uncertainty is what makes Alexandrite feel unstable. Not physically, but perceptually. It refuses to stay consistent long enough to be fully understood. And in a list defined by inaccessibility, that matters more than it seems. Because sometimes the hardest thing to hold is something that won't remain the same, and the next stone moves even further away from public experience. Because this time, it's not about perception, it's about a level of rarity so extreme that even experts spend entire careers without ever encountering one. Ranked 5th, Musgravite. The gem most experts never encounter. First identified in the remote Musgrave Ranges of Australia, this gemstone didn't enter the world through discovery in the usual sense. It entered through absence, through the realization that something should exist, but almost never does. For years after its identification, confirmed specimens could be counted in single digits, not rare in the way collectors use the word, rare in a way that limits experience itself. Even today, Musgravite remains so scarce that many professional gemologists will go their entire careers without ever seeing one in person. Not handling one, not examining one, simply seeing one outside of photographs or controlled documentation. And that detail changes its role completely. Because once a gemstone moves beyond public reach, and then beyond professional reach, it stops being part of the normal gemstone world. It becomes something else. Visually, Musgravite doesn't try to justify its rarity. Its colors tend to sit in restrained ranges. Grayish-violet, muted green, sometimes with subtle shifts that only become visible under specific lighting. There's no dramatic glow, no immediate visual signature that separates it from more common stones. In fact, to an untrained eye, Musgravite could easily be mistaken for spinel or other less rare minerals. And that's part of what makes it so elusive. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need to. Because its rarity isn't built on how it looks. It's built on how rarely it exists in a form that can be recognized, confirmed, and preserved. But here's where the distance becomes absolute. Unlike previous stones, Musgravite doesn't circulate. It doesn't appear in standard auctions. It doesn't move through visible markets. When specimens do surface, they are often absorbed immediately into private collections or institutional holdings, places where access is controlled, limited, and often permanent, which means most people won't just fail to own one. They will never be in the same room as one. Pause for a moment and consider the scale of that. A natural object, formed over millions of years, existing physically on this planet, and yet functionally unreachable to almost everyone alive. At that point, rarity stops being about numbers. It becomes about separation. Separation between existence and experience. Musgravite sits on that boundary, not hidden, not restricted by law, but positioned so far outside normal access that it might as well not exist at all for the vast majority of people. And that's what makes it different from everything before it. Because until now, the barrier has always been something external. Location, recognition, formation. With Musgravite, the barrier is total. It's simply not there, in any way that can be reached. And yet, even this level of rarity is not the highest on this list, because what comes next was once considered so rare that for a period of time, it was believed the world only had two. Ranked fourth, Painite, the gem that almost didn't exist, a gemstone that, for a period of time, almost didn't exist at all. First discovered in Myanmar in the 1950s, Painite entered the scientific world quietly. A single crystal, identified and documented. Then, nothing. No new finds. No additional samples. Years passed, then decades, with no confirmation that more existed. For a long time, the global count remained at 2 known crystals, not 2 mines, not 2 deposits. 2. That number transformed Painite from a rare gemstone into something closer to a geological anomaly, an event rather than a resource. It wasn't something that could be searched for, traded, or even expected to appear again. It simply happened once, and then, as far as anyone could tell, it stopped. That kind of rarity changes how a gemstone is perceived, because when something exists in such limited quantity, it no longer belongs to the normal cycles of discovery and distribution. It becomes isolated from the idea of ownership itself. You don't acquire it. You acknowledge that it exists. Visually, Painite carries a deep brownish-red tone, sometimes subtle, sometimes almost opaque depending on the specimen. It doesn't have the immediate brilliance of more commercial gemstones. There's no dramatic flash, no obvious spectacle, which makes its story even more unusual, because its significance was never about appearance. It was about existence. And then, something shifted. In the early 2000s, additional Painite deposits were discovered. More crystals began to surface, enough to move it out of the category of almost non-existent. But that shift didn't make it common. It simply changed the scale of its rarity, from impossible to barely possible. Even with these new discoveries, high-quality, faceable Painite remains exceptionally scarce. Most specimens are too small, too included, or too structurally limited to become gemstones in the traditional sense. What reaches collectors and institutions still represents a fraction of what has been found, which creates a strange contradiction. Painite exists in greater numbers now than it once did, but its accessibility hasn't meaningfully changed, because rarity at this level isn't just about how many pieces are found. It's about how many become visible to the world. Pause for a moment and consider this. If something goes from almost none to slightly more than none, does that actually make it accessible? Or does it simply make the idea of it more believable without changing the reality? Painite sits in that space, no longer a myth, but not truly part of the world people can experience. And that's what makes it so important in this progression, because it marks the point where rarity stops being about hidden access and starts becoming something closer to absence itself. And yet, even Painite, once thought to be nearly unique, still operates within the boundaries of discovery. The next stone moves beyond that, because this time, the limitation isn't how many exist, it's who controls them, and whether access was ever meant to be open in the first place. Ranked third, Jadeite, the gem you can't simply buy. Up to this point, rarity has been defined by nature, where a stone forms, how often it appears, and whether it survives in usable form. Imperial Jadeite changes that completely, because this is no longer just a geological story, it's a controlled one. Jadeite in general is not unknown. It exists in multiple qualities, colors, and forms. It appears in markets, jewelry, and collections around the world. But imperial-grade Jadeite, the highest level, operates under entirely different rules. A vivid, saturated green, translucent, almost glowing from within, a texture so fine and uniform that light doesn't just pass through it, it lingers. This is the version that defines Jadeite at its peak, and it is almost never available in the way people expect. Because unlike other gemstones that flow through global markets, Imperial Jadeite is shaped by something else entirely: control. The most important source of Myanmar has long been tied to complex layers of restriction, private ownership, political influence, and tightly managed distribution channels. High-quality material rarely enters open circulation. When it does, it doesn't move through casual markets or standard retail. It moves through relationships, through networks that are built over time, often invisible to the outside world. Which means access isn't just about money, it's about position. Even at major auctions, Imperial Jadeite behaves differently. Prices can reach extraordinary levels, but the transaction itself often reflects something deeper than value. Cultural significance, historical continuity, and long-standing collector circles all play a role in determining who acquires what. And for those outside that system, the barrier is nearly invisible, but absolute, because nothing explicitly says it cannot be owned. And yet, almost no one ever reaches it. That's what makes Imperial Jadeite so different from the stones before it. It isn't rare because it failed to form. It isn't rare because it disappeared. It is rare because access has been quietly narrowed, over time, by forces that extend far beyond geology. Pause for a moment and consider this. If a gemstone exists in significant value, if it is traded, collected, and preserved, but only within a closed system, does it truly belong to the global market, or does it belong only to those already inside it? That question defines Imperial Jadeite, a gemstone that is visible but not reachable, known but not accessible, and perhaps most importantly, desired in a way that reinforces its distance. Because the more people recognize its value, the more tightly it is held. And that creates a form of rarity that doesn't fade. It intensifies. But even this level of controlled access is not the final stage, because the next stone doesn't rely on systems, markets, or networks to remain out of reach. It exists in a way that bypasses all of them, not controlled, not restricted, simply not available to the world at all. Ranked second, Serendibite, the gem that exists, but not for the world. At this level, rarity is no longer about difficulty. It becomes about separation. Serendibite was first discovered in Sri Lanka in the early 20th century, not as a gemstone, but as a mineral specimen. Dense, dark, almost opaque at first glance. It didn't arrive with brilliance or visual appeal. It arrived quietly, cataloged, and then largely forgotten outside of scientific circles. For years, that's where it stayed, because what Serendibite is and what it can become are two very different things. Most of what exists is not gem quality. The majority of specimens are too dark, too included, too structurally limited to ever interact with light in a meaningful way. They exist as minerals, real, documented, but visually closed off. And then, on extremely rare occasions, something changes. A crystal forms with just enough clarity, just enough transparency, just enough internal structure to allow light to move through it. That's when Serendibite crosses into something else entirely. A gemstone so rare that even within the global gemstone community, confirmed faceable pieces can be counted in extraordinarily small numbers. Not approximated, not estimated, counted. And unlike earlier stones, where rarity still allowed for controlled access, Serendibite doesn't operate with invisible systems at all. It doesn't circulate. It doesn't appear. It doesn't enter markets in any consistent way. When gem-quality Serendibite is found, it is almost immediately absorbed into private collections or institutional holdings. No listings, no announcements, no predictable path from discovery to ownership, which creates a form of rarity that feels almost detached from reality. Because most people won't fail to buy it. They will never even encounter the possibility of buying it. Pause for a moment and consider this. If a gemstone exists, if it has been cut, studied, even owned. But there is no visible path to it. Does it still function as part of the world people can access? Or does it exist in a closed loop, discovered, contained, and removed from public experience? Serendibite exists inside that loop, not hidden in the traditional sense, not restricted by law or geography, but positioned so far outside normal exposure that it effectively disappears from public awareness. And that's what makes it different from everything before it. Because up to this point, rarity has always left a trace, a market, a record, a chance. With Serendibite, even that trace begins to fade. It is known. It is real. But it is not part of the world most people will ever interact with. And that places it just one step below the final position. Because the last stone on this list doesn't just exist outside public reach. It exists in a way that challenges whether access was ever part of its story at all. In first place, Poudretteite. At the highest level of rarity, something unusual happens. The story stops being about discovery and starts becoming about disappearance. Poudretteite was first identified in Canada within a geological site that would later become one of the most scientifically significant mineral localities in the world, Mont Saint-Hilaire. But like many of the stones on this list, its earliest existence wasn't recognized for what it truly was. It existed quietly, unnoticed, misunderstood. And then for a brief moment, it emerged. Small crystals, soft pink tones, a delicacy that feels almost out of place in a gemstone, as if the structure itself is too refined to be common. Unlike the aggressive brilliance of diamonds or the deep saturation of rubies, Poudretteite doesn't overwhelm the eye. It draws attention slowly, a pale, luminous pink that seems to hold light rather than reflect it. Subtle, controlled, almost fragile in appearance, but incredibly precise in formation. And then, just as quickly as it appeared, it became scarce again. The original source that produced the finest material no longer yields the same quality. High-grade specimens are no longer entering the world in any meaningful way. What exists today largely comes from discoveries that have already happened, not from ongoing supply, which changes everything. Because now Poudretteite is no longer part of a cycle, it's part of a closed chapter. And that creates a different kind of rarity. One that isn't just defined by how little exists, but by the fact that what exists is no longer being replaced. There is no next discovery waiting to rebalance the market. No new source expected to appear, only a finite number of stones, already in motion. And where are they? Not in stores, not in public displays, not in places where chance encounters happen. They are held in private collections, in controlled environments, in spaces where access is not just limited, it is intentional, which leads to a quiet but important realization. Most people will never hold Poudretteite, not because they weren't early enough, not because they didn't search hard enough, but because by the time they learn it exists, it's already gone. Pause for a moment and consider this. If a gemstone enters the world, is briefly visible, and then slowly disappears into private hands, at what point does it stop being part of the world at all? At what point does it become something that exists only through description, through images, through stories, through records of what once circulated freely? Poudretteite sits at that final boundary, not hidden, not restricted, simply no longer available in any meaningful way. And that is what makes it the rarest gem on this list. Not because it cannot be found, but because its presence in the world is already fading. A gemstone that didn't just resist access, but quietly moved beyond it. By now, one thing is clear. The rarest gemstones were never just the hardest to find. They were the ones that quietly moved out of reach. Some were limited by nature, some by control, and some simply stopped appearing. Until all that remained was the idea of them. Because at a certain point, rarity stops being about price or beauty. It becomes about access. If something exists, but you will never see it, never touch it, does it really belong to your world, or only to those who reached it first? And somewhere right now, new stones are forming, destined to follow the same path. Not hidden, not lost, just never meant to be held. If one of these stones stood out, leave it below, because sometimes what matters most isn't what exists, it's what remains out of reach.